international policy and a new social contract. Very pleased to have some very eminent speakers with us who are very busy at the moment. I think everybody who's going to speak, everyone who's listening, is aware of the breadth of the current challenge facing humanity around the world. In a few minutes, I'll turn to my colleague Salil Tripathi, who will reflect on the report he wrote last week, looking at some of the business and human rights dimensions of this. Now, the aim of this webinar is to think past the immediate responses, to see whether our priority is to get back to normal as soon as possible, or rather to develop a new normal. For example, do we have now a different understanding of who we mean by essential workers, and also what is meant by essential commodities, essential products, or essential services? How resilient are our supply chains to ESG factors, such as the effects of the COVID virus, and pre-existing challenges that we already have, like climate change? Do the answers to these questions amount to a seismic shift? Are they a new social contract, perhaps? Or will we look back in 5 years' time, and as we did after the 2008 financial crisis, and see that not much has changed structurally in how markets work or how we value our workers? Now, to open this up, we have on stage at the moment Sharan Burrow, the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, and John Denton, the General Secretary of the International Chamber of Commerce. And in a few minutes, we'll be joined by Anita Ramasastry, a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and Marcela Manubens, who is the Global Vice President for Integrity and Social Sustainability from Unilever, and my colleague Salil Tripathi from IHRB. Just so everybody knows, we've chosen this platform because of its strong GDPR credentials. It did crash an hour ago, and we know we've got 440 people signed up. So we're very much hoping it's not going to crash again. If it did crash for any reason, we are recording this. It will be live streamed on our website and on YouTube, so everyone will get to read it. It is not Chatham House. Everything is going on record, so please be aware that this is a public event. Just to say, beyond today, we have two others coming up. We have one on Bangladesh with a supply chain focused on the 7th of May, and one focused on trade, commodity trading, with the OECD and Swiss government and the London Metals Exchange on the 20th of May. So everybody's very much invited to them. Okay, well, Sharan, let's start with you. You've been calling for a new social contract. What do you mean by that?
Well, we already had real fractures in the global economic model that were creating, social ruptures around the world. You saw the age of anger that had erupted last year, and we had people on the streets in every continent. We saw actually this generating a lack of trust in democracy, which I hope for everybody is pretty frightening. And it comes from fear, and the fear that's generated by insecurity. We had a convergence of crisis, John, and we already had inequality, which has largely driven that anger. We then had, of course, the climate emergency, been with us for a long time, but the world only woke up in 2015 that we needed a global solution. And since then, we've seen the world backtracking from that. But the devastating climate events have cost us lives and livelihoods, and in fact may very well, with other areas associated like fires and floods, put the very economic model unaffordable for working people. So whatever way you looked at it, inequality, the climate convergence, progress is stalled for women on every level, despite the fact that we know that women's participation is the best multiplier for economic growth and productivity, along with infrastructure investment we can drive, and of course jobs. We used to have mandates where central banks actually had a mandate for full employment, still there in a lot of central banks' charters, but disappeared. And then we had the dehumanizing model of supply chains. It's such an irony for me today that, instead of fighting for the rights and the due diligence, which you've been a leader in, John, that would clean up those supply chains around the world, we are now fighting with John and indeed other business leaders to save our SMEs. And the vulnerability of non-essential supply chains is extraordinary. They're just collapsing. And that's in a world where 70% of people don't have any or adequate social protection. So that's the situation we have. And now you have in the emergency phase. You've seen a lot of good action from governments, but they themselves have realised the failures of the failure to regulate the labour market, because as well as paid sick leave and wage guarantees, two of our priorities, we've also called for income support for those in non-standard forms of work. And in developed economies, of course, that includes platform businesses and freelancers and so-called dependent contractors, but actually dependent on one person, or the breakdown in professions like journalism with contracts that are moderated across the internet, where you can now in Europe earn as little as 15 euro a day, because that's the price for an article, or 50 if you're a high-end specialist. You can't live on either of those figures. So we're seeing the breakdown of regulated work everywhere, failure to regulate the labour market. Now, I understand the competitive advantage for businesses, don't have to take any responsibility for workers, and I'm not arguing that all work should be actually an old-fashioned direct employment where you're not mixing a variety of work or mixing telework, although I want to get out of captivity. So for me, telework's kind of not my favourite venue. But whether we're mixing telework or we're mixing, part-time work and internet contracts and so on, we can fix this. The labour protection floor that we negotiated last year at the ILO said two very important things. Well, four actually, but one is a labour protection floor for all workers. We can fight court by court case if we need to, let's hope not, on the employment relationship and the disguised employment that is actually just obscuring that and the responsibility. But we can also simply agree that all labour rights, all the fundamental standards in occupational health and safety, and indeed maximum hours of work and forgotten one, underpin all work. No discrimination, underpin all work. And then the other part was social protection floor. And I'll come back to that very briefly, because that's the other breakdown that's now being exposed by this. But the other was just transition for the systemic shift in climate, that we have to transition every sector, and building trust, and therefore having unions at the design table with business actually looking and designing the future, basically, so that people have trust that they'll have jobs or support, and indeed communities won't be left simply deserted. And the other one is an economic agenda for women. So put those things together and you have the heart of the new social contract. But we also see, in fact, the exposure of another piece that's in that declaration, which is our underfunding of vital public services. Now, I'm not going to be, again, orthodox about the model, but if anyone tells me that you can no longer have universal access to healthcare, that you can't afford, and it's run on public health principles, well, then that's a fight we'll have, because this is exposed that we can never be there again. And on the social protection front, then we know that we could fix this. The world promised, indeed now, 10 years ago, the Bachelet report, a framework for social protection that we would fund to build resilience. So initially, world would fund it for the poorest countries. Well, it's not there. You know what it would cost? We're spending maybe 10 trillion already. Could it be as high as 20 by the end of the recovery and reconstruction phase? $35 billion for the poorest 28 countries would get us, health, income support, food support, and other essential measures for 5 years. That's 5 years, do the sums. And then if you added it to about 100 trillion, you could part pay where it's inadequate in terms of coverage in low to middle income countries. And just to give you the figures, we could lose 200 million jobs, or in full-time equivalent hours, 200 million. And we have already the prospect urgently of up to 250 million people facing starvation. If you don't act now, and that was what I was trying to convince the G20 ministers to act now on, something that John and I totally agree on, is, saving our SMEs and looking at how you support those non-essential supply chains so that they are there to help us get to, I think you're right, John, a new normal. I don't think the old normal's coming back, but we have to be thoughtful about that. And of course, social protection, but we're also petitioning them to sit at the table with the real economies the real actors in the economy, workers and employers, and redesign the future for indeed resilience, recovery and resilience. And that means an integration of all those areas of crisis, plus having an honest look at the threats and the opportunities of technology. Lots of opportunities, but lots of threats, surveillance, privacy, you know, we could go into it. And my final point is we have to rethink the model of trade. No one's going to oppose trade, certainly not me, jobs depend on it, but we kind of let it get out of whack. And if you go back to the original the last big, and it looks like a kind of cake run now, but the era of the Marshall Plans and others where the world came together, we built the UN system, the ILO, the WHO a bit later and so on. In 47, I think it was, the Havana Principles provided a much more human-centered approach. When the world leaders came together at that time, not the developed economies, I'm sorry to say to people, but world leaders came together, they saw that they must have a social floor, they must have a social base. So they built the ILO, and we have labour rights and standards. We have the UN 75th anniversary of human rights, off which freedom of association and actually hangs. So we need to go back and say what matters in our society. How do we put people and the planet first in recovery and resilience? And I'm delighted to say, I'm glad John's on the frame, because while we'll have good, strong discussions, and that we should, about what that looks like, nevertheless, I've enjoyed working with John. We take pride in the fact that we were part of the lobbying effort around debt relief. We wanted aligned with the social, the SDGs, not in fact aligned with the old structural reform, which will put people again under the table. But we do need to then look, and we of course have talked to, you know, the head of the IMF about, you know, resilience and use of funds, emergency funds, but also special drawing rights and liquidity swaps and so on. There's a lot of good can come out of those institutional settings, but we need global coordination. And to be really honest with you, I haven't written it yet, but I saw some great ministers arguing for it, but I did not see a willingness to do anything more than make a political statement today, and that's just not good enough. So put people and planet first, a new social contract, and let those of us who want to help redesign the world have a voice.
Thank you, Sharan, for that amazing start. So in a way, in a nutshell, although you see it as a 1919 moment or a 1947 moment, the Labour ministers you're talking today, not many of them see it in quite those terms yet, but they will.
Yet.
John Denton, what about business? How much of what Sharan has said would you put your name behind and ally with? Do you see it as a new social contract?
Well, maybe I'll frame it slightly differently, but let me be extremely clear. Sharan and I share a very similar framework of thinking about how we need to rebuild post COVID-19. We also share a very similar framework about the need to stop the carnage, halt further disruption, and this rebuild. The challenge is that it'd be nice if this was all sequential, but we have to do it all at the same time. And I think one of the most important things there is that a number of the players who are engaged in this attempt to reshape policy at this point in time have to have a high level of trust amongst themselves and a preparedness to collaborate. What I've seen with Sharan and the ITUC, and hopefully Sharan sees with us, is that the essence of collaboration is that we actually we respect each other's interests. We put them at the same level, which doesn't mean we agree with each other on everything, but we do respect each other's interests. We put them at the same level. That enables a level of collaboration that possibly has been difficult to achieve before amongst other players in this space. I mean, we don't pretend to be an employers group. We speak on behalf of commerce, on behalf of companies, entities that build businesses, some of which don't have employees. They're not involved in a labour capital debate. They're involved in a framing of the world which is built around our ethos, which is enabling business worldwide to secure peace, prosperity and opportunity for all. So just to be quick here, The ICC, we were born in the ashes of the First World War, so 1917, but our centennial was 2019 because we were thinking about the creation of the ICC in 17 as part of the League of Nations concept, and frankly, not dissimilar to some of the points Sharan made. You know, we stood up where governments were unable to act, which is really the point. And I think this is going to be an increasingly interesting piece or interesting territory for groups like the ICC and ITUC and a few others. In a way, we are unique in our own special way. I mean, everyone is in their own way. I mean, we are the institutional voice of 45 million businesses globally. We speak for businesses in the global north and south. In fact, prior to this call, I was just involved in a discussion where we were pulling together the sovereign wealth funds, etc., and pension funds with others in Africa to try and support a level of cooperation. And similarly, I've just in another call earlier this morning in Latin America, and then another one in the Pan-Arab world. So it's important for us to reflect that. I mean, why should the debate about the purpose of the corporation be a Wall Street debate? I mean, for God's sake, I mean, business leaders in Beirut have a view on this as well. So one of our jobs is to bring that through. We bring it through on the basis that we actually have clear principles. So our purpose is to enable business worldwide to secure prosperity and opportunity for all. We're 45 million strong. We actually are not-for-profit, purpose-driven institution. We can set policy. Because of our size and scale and our independence, we can create norms and standards, and we have our own courts, so we can also govern space. The reason that all becomes relevant is that not only are we trying to halt the carnage, mitigate further loss, but then contemplate this issue of the rebuild. And we do have, and it's important for the players to actually have legitimacy in that latter debate as well. And that's one of the issues we're focused on at the moment. We've been very keen to engage on a policy level, but also at a practical level, just the nature of who we are. So we can create policy, but we actually are very practical, not dissimilar to business itself. I mean, coming up with practical solutions. And so we have been looking at building tools and supports for SMEs. But of course, one thing that becomes bleedingly obvious to you when you're engaged in the carnage of COVID-19 on an economic side is the speed with which value chains and supply chains have just been destroyed. And as Sharan correctly pointed out, non-essential supply chains are almost seen as discretionary. And the problem with that is that there's an awful lot of people got hurt. And of course, there's a different perspective that can be shaped around in developing economies and in developed economies. The reality is that in developed economies, there is generally more headroom to engage in some of the fiscal stimulus and actually support. There's particular problems about inability to actually make accessible with the speed required, and sometimes people are too slow, and get the money to the SMEs and micro SMEs. In developing economies, and I'm speaking in the broad, there just isn't the headroom. And so that's one reason we work very closely at a macro policy level on this issue of debt relief, because it's incredibly important that the international financial institutions not impede, by the way, their ability to support emerging economies, but also that emerging economies are actually not caught with that hideous choice of, do we pay doctors and nurses, or do we service the debt on our loans? And we needed to remove that for a start. So we had to work at that level. But at the same time, we are deeply engaged at a regional level, then at a country-specific level, about how do we untap the opportunities to actually save as many SMEs as possible, which is why we launched this global Save Our SME campaign. But importantly in that, there are different requirements in different regions. I mean, Latin America has particular issues. It also has fewer countries. It also has a very effective development bank, I would say, and I spent time with Moreno and his team there. What we're trying to do is work out ways by utilising access to the real economy of trying to understand the most efficient way of getting funds to business. Because as you know, Mexico has taken a particular view that it will not stimulate the real economy, that it would prefer to invest in longer term structural issues. But of course, the real economy is collapsing as we speak. Ecuador's already in default. So, you know, there's particular issues that need to be brought to bear there. Africa is a different story. Pan-Arab world is a different story. So we can have global principles, which is what we do, which is working on with Sharan and others, the G20 in terms of trying to ensure that there's cooperation at a global level, so that the stimulus packages that are offered at an individual level don't get lost if others are not cooperating. And of course, that's one thing you're seeing, a huge detriment of the current, the lack of international cooperation means that a lot of good money is actually going down the drain. So the need for cooperation is critical. The other is that we're actually fighting the right fight. This is not a time for the playbook from 0809. This is a real economy hit. This is a real economy hit. We actually need to focus on that. Obviously, sorry, none of this, and may I just move too quickly, none of this denies the reality this is a health crisis. Sorry, I would hate my comments to be to somehow indicate that we don't consider this to be a health crisis. In fact, our position on this is that this is a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a societal crisis. Yeah. And our job is to be a trusted partner in grappling with all those issues, which is why we create a relationship with the WHO, etc. But I'm really just focused because I've sort of come in on the supply chain side, and also getting the trade ministers focused. This is not a time for new protectionism, which inhibits the capacity for protective goods and services to transfer across borders. I spoke at the trade or the G20 trade officials meeting yesterday. It's not time for people to be on their high horses about positions. There's practical work to be done. We accept there will be some restrictions, but they must be short-lived. They must be monitored and off. We also know that there's some repurposing that needs to go on here. There's already an agreement running around that could actually be used to actually support the making available of pharmaceutical goods and products, and actually on a list which actually makes it easier. And plus it's an opportunity as well to actually move the world from an analog to a digital platform in terms of trade. So there's lots of things that can go on. Then moving to this societal issue, and how do we build back? I mean, Sharon's talked about reconstruction and resilience. I mean, we see this as critical issues. We are starting a process of how do we engage in a broader public debate and start shaping that debate in a way which is respectful of our ethos, which is enabling business. That is actually what is the global institutional settings, what they should look like, what is the role for business in society, and what do we need for a productive and effective private sector in the 21st century post-COVID. They're the three broad themes, and we'll be working through 10, 12 questions on that, and there'll be a global debate on it. Sorry, I'm jumbled it all up, but that's what I wanted to say.
Can I just a quick follow-up to you, John, and then I'm going to ask Sharon the same question too. When you're talking to governments, particularly governments in emerging economies, like you were mentioning there, do they get this idea of building back differently, this idea of moving to a new normal, the fairer, more resilient normal, or is that just a bit of a luxury for them? Or are you getting political buy-in from around the world, both of you? So starting with you, John.
I think all governments are divided, but it's because populations are divided. If you think about those who have joined the unemployment queues, and we're looking at, unemployment in the developed economies, particularly outside of Europe, that we haven't seen since the 1990s recession, some going back to the Great Depression. So that's not going to come back quickly. Like once you reopen, to retool and re-employ people, we're going to be very cautious. So we are going to have new levels of unemployment, just a fact. We are also going to have governments who, whatever our trade aficionados might say, and yes, there's an argument that global trade has bought us cheaper prices, including for the poor, etc. But nations aren't going to be left without the resilience of being able to scale up essential products when they need to, should another crisis hit us, etc. And people who've watched a model where, whatever the kind of challenges around jobs and so on, but there's been a decreasing trust in globalization, which is, again, a factual reality, and people see an opportunity to bring some of those jobs back. Now, here's where, I think you have to balance that with then what is the space for industry policy and development and resilience in developing economies. And again, if you don't have social protection floor, if you don't have due diligence by multinational enterprises, if you don't have governments willing to actually regulate the global market, whatever the new normal might be, then we're going to see traditional divides that won't get us anywhere. So when John says we'll have different views, but we have to work it out, we do. We absolutely do. I'm never going to tell you that we don't need trade. We had it before the WTO. We had it, and so there were always monopolies, but we built policies to deal with that. Now we've ignored competition policy or antitrust policy. I mean, I don't understand why the big global companies are not yelling, because those who closed their doors in an act of solidarity, like the rest of us, who gave up civic freedoms to actually save lives, and John's right about that, biggest, highest priority. But if we don't acknowledge that Amazon didn't close its doors, it just stepped in, and now you're looking at even more powerful global monopoly. Now, again, it's not about technology not being the future. It's how do we have a balanced economy that actually drives shared prosperity and due diligence by those companies. It's an irony for me that if you want to look at the weakness of the model for companies, and I'm sympathetic, I'm actually out there. We released a statement on textiles yesterday. It's just one industry, but with the another employer body, the IOE and the ILO. And we're calling for support, liquidity for those large companies, as well as an emergency fund for small to medium enterprises. But why big companies? Because they are so cash poor, because they're not getting any income in, that in fact they're not paying their orders, even existing orders. And so that means, you know, the business collapses in Bangladesh or Cambodia or Indonesia, or pick a country, Ethiopia, and workers are out of work, but they also don't have social protection to fall back on. So you look at the vicious circle and say, we have to fix some of the flaws, and then we can look at, you know, what is a sustainable and resilient model. So again, it's not throwing it's not throwing everything up in the air, because we have to have some security and stability, but it is having a good, cold, hard, honest look at what we've allowed to happen in terms of the dignity of work, or the lack thereof, and human rights more generally, and what we need to do to make sure that we have robust systems of economy, and that means business and trade.
Thank you, Sharan. Back to you, John. I mean, did business meet? I mean, I know COVID is a health crisis, but are there reasons why supply chains aren't more resilient? That workers deep down supply chains are at risk. There's, it doesn't matter if you, for example, if in 5 years' time you have 20 million member companies as opposed to 40 million. Does diversity in the global economy matter? Other structural problems that did pre-exist the COVID crisis that have actually added to the fragility of the current environment around business?
Well, I don't know if the fragility has been revealed. I mean, I think it's fair to say that if you've got the unholy troika operating simultaneously, which is health systems that are not functioning, poor governance, and poor society relationships, if they're all working simultaneously, you're being dramatically exposed at this point in time. And that's what's actually happening in a number of economies. Some economies have a stronger one or stronger two, and some have a stronger three, but a stronger all three. But there's actually a real issue there. I mean, the pandemic of itself, by the way, is not a black swan. It's actually, I mean, I'm on a number of boards. I know Sharon's been on a number of boards, and the pandemic is always considered. The actual black swan in all this, frankly, is the lack of global leadership. We all have plans. Sit on boards and owns it. We all have plans for a pandemic when it hits. What's missing in this is that everyone assumed, rightly, that there'd be a level of cooperation at a global level, which was really the full enunciation or the full elaboration of a globalized world, where we all saw it was in our mutual interests. Anyway, that's not how it's playing out. And so then the issue is, how do you build resilience back in, and how do you get the balance right? And when I talk about the piece that we're working on now, is that we don't want the future just to happen to us. I mean, our view is we should help shape it, enabling of the private sector to do what it does best. And when it does operate at its best, it is an enabler of peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. But actually getting that right. But you've got to be careful here. I mean, some of the resilience people say needs to be built back in. the costs of doing so may well undermine the capacity to invest in a number of areas and may actually undermine the capacity to employ. This is a systems collapse now. We have to think about this in a systems where I talk about enabling an environment and actually being involved in an environment. From our point of view, we think a market economy is effective. We actually want to operate in an open market economy which is globally linked. But we understand there are externalities to that, one of which has been the growing rise in global inequality. We understand another externality now is it's a enabler of infection.
Yeah.
At an extreme rate. We need to actually think about how do we manage those. You know, the reality with a pandemic, the lack of global cooperation is critical. The other thing it's revealed is like 1 in 5 governments have no plan which actually engages the private sector. I don't know, Sharan, you're probably doing the same thing about engaged with organised labour. But hey, come on, that's crazy.
Yeah, no.
How do you rebuild now unless you engage with the actual end users? How do you rebuild unless you engage with the people who work within the rebuild as well? So, and cooperation, and please, I mean, the idea that somehow you cede or control, and I know there's some wonderful people on the call for the United Nations, that's just not going to fly.
Yeah.
It's not that I'm saying think about the structure first. We really have to think about what the problems are, what the strategy is, and how do we enable the kind of collaboration we're talking about here, and how do we shape things such that you can, in a sense, help repurpose some existing institutions and frankly blow a couple up and actually do things differently. We should be thinking about repurposing a lot of things as well, rather than just starting again or things should be on as they are. Maybe I've spoken too much.
Right. Sharan,
Can I just give you a position that is kind of reversed to show you that there does need to be conversation and people are thoughtful. The B20 today called for a global employment plan. You know? Now, we would say, yes, please, and as John says, let's talk about that and talk about what that looks like with governments, both nationally and globally. And I saw a question on your screen about, but don't we need universal basic income for everybody? And he was quoting somebody else, but where does that fit in the new social contract? We've always called for a form of basic income. It's in the social contract. It's pensions, unemployment benefits, child protection, maternity protection, disability pensions, and so on, many of which business, by the way, have supported. But why would you give, if someone's in a good job, and if it's a good unionised, decent work job, why would I get universal basic income when I have a decent salary? And you'd rather put it into supporting the resilience and the capacity for, you know, sort of dignified living for the poor. So I just think we have to be careful about, some of the concepts are great, but we have to, as John said, look at whether our systems are fit for purpose. And if they're not, let's indeed look at what needs to be done.
Great, thank you. Bringing in Marcela Manubens from Unilever. Marcela, you've been dealing with this 100 times a day, I think. Does the Unilever supply chain, does this feel like anything completely different? Something completely different from anything else you've dealt with before?
That's a great question. I mean, my history with Unilever dates from 2013 onwards. And I reflect on that. There were two situations that probably not quite the same, but were equal crisis. I was in another industry that Sharan mentioned, in the fashion industry, in September 11th. And I was in New York City.
John, can't hear you. I can hear you fine, Marcela. John, we're gonna we'll sort out your acoustics the other end. But I can hear myself.
So you can hear me. Okay, so September 11, and what it came afterwards, and the cascading effect also that had for American business and overseas, resemble a little bit of the thinking that we are deploying right now. And the other is 2008, the crisis in 2008, which was totally different to what we have today, but also created this particularly in an industry that is non-essential, like it was apparel, created a series of consequences that Sharan was referring to in countries like Bangladesh and other parts of the world. But this pandemic is different. I think that it felt like a tsunami, right? It feels still like a tsunami. It starts in one region of the world and continue cascading, and we see a whole series of actions by government and private sector, and the role of business, right? And the concern in everybody. It feels also to the discussion that has been going on, unfortunately, this divided world, it feels like you are choosing between life or economic survival, right? I mean, those two, and there's nothing in the middle. And there are two very distinctive camps that will take those positions. So what does a company, and particularly a supply chain like ours, I mean, for many of the people attending today, the listeners, I mean, we have a very large and expansive supply chain. And when you look into that tsunami and different companies, different suppliers being in different parts of the world, it's extraordinarily difficult to manage that logistics. But what we have done, I mean, the thinking that we have done at this moment in time, for me, has been extraordinary. First of all, there has been a tremendous internally united approach. There has been this incredible drive for action. You have seen some of the things that we have done. I mean, the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, I mean, actually had the hand wash campaign that started many years back. And when you think about the whole effort that we did, and we did it in India, deploying that and ensuring that health and safety and promoting better practices with the public, etc., is an extraordinary work. I mean, it was discussed too about, I think, a small business. We recognize early on that small and medium enterprises will have quite a significant challenge. Oh, there is Anita and Salil. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, guys. That we're going to be much at, exposed. Many of those businesses do not have cash flow that can keep them in business for a longer time. So we step in and help in creating a cash flow funding facility of €500 million to help those entities, or in the relief work that we have done, or guaranteeing works, and certainly working with partners. I mean, working with DFID and WEF and many local NGOs to really, and unions, making sure that we can deploy the relief in the places where are most needed. But most significantly is the economic activity. When you look into and this is what is different for me, where I was in September 11 or in 2008 by being now at Unilever. I mean, we have essential products. You have soap, you have house disinfectants, we have food. And to a certain degree, that bias for action that I was referring to, even if people were not technically formally authorized, I mean, start transforming facilities to produce hand sanitizing lotion, to increase the production of soap, or making sure that we can bring that to the most needy communities. And where, in spite of all the interest of and policies of the governments, I mean, there are parts of the world where social distancing is impossible. I mean, unfortunately, issues that Sharan addressed and John addressed in terms of the conditions in the country, right? You know, there are many families sharing one bathroom, or you have scenarios that they are not perfect. And if you are in those communities and you operate in those communities, you had to help. So it has been an extraordinary work. I mean, I can talk more later on, but no, this pandemic is like not like any other in my lifetime that I have experienced, although it has certain elements. And probably it's gonna, the world that we are gonna confront when we come out of this will be one that will look really different.
Thank you, Marcela. I'm going to move straight on to Anita now. In a sense, Anita, the government's been mentioned a lot, but particularly by Sharan and John, and the failure of government and the challenges of government. And Now, you represent a part of the rules-based system. You used to work in government. You're now on the UN Working Group for Business and Human Rights. What's your perspective on this, Anita? Do we have the tools we need, and will the rules-based system survive this?
Yes, well, I think we have some of the tools. We may not have the answers. I'm a historian by training, actually, and when I think back about institutions, someone mentioned, wars and what was born out of World War II. One of the questions I have now is it time for new institutions? What will happen? But I really want to focus on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And they're quasi-rules-based, right? Because people often say, well, they're not binding, at least when it comes to the private sector. But they really were prescriptive in a way that gave, I think, governments and states some answers that they should have deployed before. I live in Seattle, and I'm surrounded by large global companies who were very impacted by this, from Amazon to Microsoft to Starbucks to Boeing. I'm also in a place where, thanks to these companies existing, I can still have a latte, and while I shelter at home, a $5 tip gets my groceries delivered to me. So when I think about all kinds of essential, or I really call them frontline workers, when I think of frontline workers right now, I hope that the invisible become visible, right, to all of us, which is that we see that person who, for $5, is bringing me my food and letting me live while they are risking their life. I mean, at the end of the day, this is the larger challenge for all of us, and one hopes that the compassion and empathy that we all have will drive us to better policy. But back to the guiding principles. The guiding principles really tell states, right, that it's their job to drive responsible business conduct through various actions. And now is the time to put those processes in place. We're travelers, John, but we used to be at a much more leisurely pace, right? Business and human rights has been around for several decades now, and the guiding principles, we're about to celebrate the 10th anniversary. But now we got to speed it up, and it's like a short order putting out fires. Pillar 1 of the guiding principles talks about the state duty, and the state duty really encompasses things like when governments support business, right, when they give them incentives and credits and bailouts and all kinds of support, when government itself acts as a procurer, which it is doing now, right, ventilators and masks. In all of those, it needs to be consistent in asking for businesses to respect human rights, right? Now, how that works and what it looks like, we can work it out, but there needs to be a commitment. Years ago, governments made those same commitments in terms of corruption, right? When we give money to companies, we ask them to sign certain pledges, and then we try to actually monitor their behavior. Now's the time to do that, especially when we're providing assistance, both domestically, and then in terms of transnationally, when we talk about development assistance and an engagement with bilateral assistance and finance. So that to me is key. And the other part of the guiding principles is that smart mix piece, right? We can't forget regulation. So Sharan mentioned several times due diligence, right? We're on that cusp where the EU is looking at it. We've been looking at it for a very long time. Now's the time to say, make it so, right? Require mandatory human rights due diligence so companies are future-proofing their business activities. They are looking ahead and looking at the risks, and if they can't look at the risks now, right? Yeah, so this to me is key. And I'll just shortly say that in terms of companies, right, one would hope that states will prompt companies to act responsibly. But in terms of the question of, as Marcela said, choosing between kind of life, right, and sort of economic recovery, we hope that businesses, as they look at their essential workers, we need factory workers now. We also need our domestic workers, and we need people close to home. So both globally and nationally, companies, I hope, will be incentivized on their own to not cut corners, not cut contracts, and deal with wages and respect, because they have to too, right? That it's going to be essential for recovery and survival of different business models as well. There's going to be a point in time, and this is the big challenge, right? Workers, I'm now trying to track what's happening just in the US, where workers on the front lines, whether it's the nurse or whether it's the delivery person, are going to say, you can't put us in harm's way, right? We are not disposable, and you can't make us go do these things. And if no one's willing to do that because the risk is too high, then the economy just shuts down. So that's my point, and I just say that the guiding principles may not be the only solution, but they're a pretty good roadmap for states, and states need to move forward with these commitments. So thanks.
Thank you, Anita. I'll come back to you in a bit. Salil, you've written the report, the 60-page report that came out last week, which was trying to capture some of the short-term things, the good things and bad things that business have been doing. and governments from a human rights perspective. So just give your reflections on what you've heard so far from everybody on the call, and also what what do we need to bear in mind as we move to the longer term implications of it.
So very huge questions, and thank you, and wonderful to listening to all of you. And in a way, there is a sense of relief that, what we tried to do very quickly in the report, some of the concerns we've been trying to articulate, I was very pleased to hear them from this distinguished panel. I mean, the examples that Marcela, you gave about what Unilever has been doing, we were able to capture that. And it's exactly the way forward about going forward. And Sharan, the points you made on social contract, yes, very necessary. And we've articulated some of that too. And Anita, all of you have been very kind to governments. And, so let me be a bit of the provocateur here, because I think governments have been disastrous and in many, many ways. And you, for various reasons, you may not be able to say that, but hey, I can. So I'm going to say that. I think they've been in denial in some cases where they think that it is not a crisis and they won't deal with it and are trying to figure out different ways of handling it in ways that can actually make it harder for people to access medication, access personal protection equipment, and so on. That's one part of it. Some governments have tried to suppress the information as it came out, and even though they were primarily responsible for what was going on, and that delay has harmed a lot of lives. Many people, thousands of people have died as a result of that, the basic human rights violation. And some governments are using this as an opportunity to crack down on traditional dissenters, whether they are trade union leaders, human rights defenders, women's rights activists, and so on. And one by one, they are being picked on, laws are being created, precisely because no one can come in the village square and protest. So I think we need to be very sure of that, and we keep mind up. Several of you have talked about the need for doing something to ensure that government is playing the role it should. And yes, oh my gosh, that is necessary. Now turning to companies, and I saw that Linda Kromjong, our friend who's now at Samsung, she had a question about can business speak with one voice? And I think one reason it cannot is exactly the kind of point that John was making. The company in Malmo having one view and the company in Beirut having another view. And I've looked at Bangladesh, for example, where there are these companies which are buyers of garments that are being made in Bangladesh, who are reneging their contracts, invoking the force majeure clause, refusing to pay for material already bought, refusing to pay for anything that is being, and it's going to make a lot of women's lives vulnerable who are working in the garment sector. 85% of the workforce of 3 million people are affected by that. Now, those Bangladeshi manufacturers see the world very differently from the way the buyers are looking at it. And we'll find this kind of supply chain disruption pretty much everywhere in every industry where there'll be a difference of perspective. And that brings me to the final point, which is that you have some companies which have done extremely well in some areas of their work. I mean, the large online delivery services have raised prices, raised the wage that they are paying. And in some cases, they've given greater sick pay. But they're also very reluctant to allow unions to get formed in those companies. So that's a problem in that setting. There are other companies which are very good at technology, and they will all give us a way to figure out that on my phone, if the person next to me has been exposed to COVID, and in which case, how do I protect myself? Sounds wonderful that a cell phone can do that. But who will hold that data? For how long? What will be done with that data? Who will control it? And what use will a government, which is a malcontent government, a malintentioned government, what will it do with that technology? That is the problem. So yes, companies are doing right in many incremental ways, and they have a problem of liquidity. It's very nice to say companies should do more and protect more, but if they have no cash to survive, how are they going to do it? So we have to rethink the way the economy functions, which brings back to the point of, how are we going to transit into a new normal? And we have to remember that, yes, it's great for everybody to have more money, but when there are too much money chasing too few goods and services, what happens? Economics 101, inflation. And who gets hurt the most by the inflation? Anywhere in the world? The poor. It's a tax on the poor. I think I'll pause there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen, and I think your report shows this, Salil, is a great variance in terms of how businesses responded in the short term. And I guess I'm going to ask this question to all of you, all 5 of you now. 2 questions, reflecting back on what I've heard. A couple of aspects. One is this difference, Unilever, €500 million, I think you mentioned, Marcela, in the sense of bailing out your supply chain, at least for the short term. Some of your competitors and others in your industry haven't done that. And is that because you're good at UNGPs? Or is it because you have more liquidity, or there's more political? I really want to get from everybody, why has there been such a variance in business response from the big companies, let alone the small ones? And the second is Anita's point about conditionality around the bailouts. You know, is the deleverage point that we want to see from governments here and the banks and everyone else is conditionality around what is expected in return for the money, both from business and from government, in terms of the SDGs and UNGPs. How much conditionality should there be in terms of the leverage that has been brought through the financial interventions? Sharan, your reflections first, and we'll go back to you.
So, I'm trying to think where to start, John. I think that the question on the financial institutions, like we've had a long argument with the World Bank and the IMF around the model of conditionality that traces back 30 years or more, really, for structural adjustment, which killed a lot of African continents to the countries, to the point where developing countries in the 90s, as you would know, didn't trust the IMF. So it was on the edge. And then it was the 2008-9 crisis, where actually when leaders were in a space where they saw that they built the G20 summit because the prime ministers and presidents wanted to actually lay out a coordinated response. And they acted in consultation with Labor and business. And we saw the beginnings of real coordination in the world. But with the 2010 G20 in Toronto, see, I've been to all of them, that's how bad this is. And then, in fact, we saw the kind of neoliberal model of the trickle-down theory win again. So structural adjustment became austerity. Now, there's nothing wrong with, planning or leveraging fiscal consolidation of growth. But we didn't get the growth, and the austerity measures not only contaminated debt levels and escalated them, but actually, because they didn't deal with the Greek fallout and so on effectively. But we saw the impact on people, and we saw the impact on the slump in global growth, and then accelerated by other areas of crisis. So do we need reform? Yes. Do we need the financial institutions to act now? Yes. But do we need reform that says, okay, let's rethink how you deal with debt, and not only debt relief for a short period, but how do we reframe it so that we're giving people space to invest in the SDGs and the growth and the sustainability and the resilience that will actually, even if we had a bit of inflation from wage-led growth, that would be very helpful right now. So, we need to rethink a lot of that. But I think, that John's right, and I can only say that on business and human rights and on the role of government, yes, please. I mean, we're in this position because governments failed to regulate, and they did with the power of wasn't it just the corporations, they'll tell you, because a lot of the real economy suffered. It was the speculative capital and the investors who drove a lot of this. And we have $37 trillion as workers' capital, pensions invested in the global economy. So we're not too happy with this either. We need a sensible approach to long-term investment, to regulation that actually looks after people and the environment, but make sure that we are also allowing for development. Because despite my commitment to the new social contract, which we saw start fall apart in the 80s, none of it would be lost on any of you that this didn't work for the developing world. It just didn't provide the space for development that it should have. And so we have massive inequality now, not just between countries, but also because of the model within countries. So we have a lot to do in reforming the financial institution. I mean, multilateralism was in crisis anyway. So do we want to go back, 2 years where everybody's wringing their hands about multilateralism in crisis? Or we want to say, what's the role? What's the function? John said this, let's work out what the function is. And, with everyone on this panel, we can then get through. But I wanted to say that at the heart of a new social contract, because it is about rights and responsibilities, is due diligence and human rights, the UN principles for business and human rights, and they must be mandated. If we're not going to actually demand responsibility for the dignity of decent work, then we'll never achieve a balanced global economy, and we'll never achieve the kind of humanity that we want to share.
John, what would you think about that? I mean, human rights due diligence mandated at the centre of this as part of the solution?
It's a very interesting discussion, I must say. And I'm sorry, Marcela, for some reason I couldn't hear you when you spoke, but I can tell you I agree with everything you said. And of course, your former CEO is my chair, Paul Pullman. So we're both blessed with the Pullman halo on our organisations. Anita, you made in a funny way. I'm relatively new to this role, so I'm not actually an industry association or international organisation kind of bureaucrat or someone who's been doing it for 100 years. So I'm straight from business into this role, and so there's things I just don't know and things that surprise me. So with that kind of level of ignorance, I make my following comments. I was not fully aware of the business and human rights agenda, and I apologise for that, but I wasn't. One thing I did do when I discovered that we were involved in it was I withdrew us from a coalition that was running it on behalf of business, because there was almost a bit like my earlier comments about how you engage on a collaborative way to move forward. There was a lack of collaboration as I saw it. And this partly picks up, I think, some of the challenges and the questions you threw out to Marcela, even though I couldn't hear a response, about companies not, there's not a level playing field on this. You can do the right thing, and I think a comment you made before, there's different perspectives on this. Look, we are not convinced there needs to be a treaty, but we are convinced there is not enough movement in terms of the way forward. And we do think it's appropriate to examine alternate pathways to achieve greater respect for human rights on a global basis. And I've got to tell you, that's from a government point of view. We think government's got a lot more work to do. And we also think there are a number of corporations we actually do need to encourage and, in fact, drag along in some cases as well. So we've broken away from what was the traditional, I suppose, business human rights employer federation view to take the ICC view on this, and we are open to engage in this discussion. The benefit of that, as hopefully Sharan has also experienced, and having that openness to collaborate means we may well find a better pathway forward or a series of pathways forward. There's not necessarily just one answer to this. And what we're saying is we are open to that. And frankly, in the emerging post-COVID world, we think it's critical to have these discussions and to be open to these discussions. And so that doesn't fix or answer immediately the earlier question, like why do some companies behave as they do? Frankly, it's a bit like why do some governments behave as they do? There's limited bandwidth and interest in some of these issues. The most focus of most organisations is survival. Survival for many will actually be seen in a sustainable context. Survival will others be seen in a purely selfish context. Our job as an organisation that has a purpose about enabling business worldwide to secure peace, prosperity and opportunity for all is not to be reduced to the lowest common denominator. It's to build a consensus based on our principles, and that's what we're seeking to do. And part of it is being open to new directions, new pathways, and frankly, not being passive, coming up with ideas as well. So I hope that it doesn't specifically answer your question, but it does indicate the approach that I think we need to take in order to advance that agenda.
It sounds like an open door, John, which is great. Marcela, why isn't everybody doing what you're doing? I mean, your competitors, other companies. I'm intrigued by how long a company like Unilever can bail out its supply chain in the current context. And how much is the UNGPs part of that? Are you doing this because of the UNGPs? And do you think if every company had to do human rights due diligence the way you've done, that more companies would be behaving responsibly, or this is wishful thinking?
I'm smiling because he is part of the answer too, right? He has been a very close advisor. I mean, I'm afraid my answer will be very simplistic, right? The issue of liquidity that Salil have addressed, why we did that? Because if you know your supply chain, if you are embedding this in your business, you know that the first people who are going to be in trouble are the small and medium enterprises. And if they are part of your supply chain, you ought to ensure that that's happening, right? That's taken care of. And our focus on this, we look into, you know, the complexities. In the complexities of the situation, we went back to the basics and we said, what matters to us? And the leadership, you know, established the strategy. But under these circumstances, safety was the first element. And we put a whole series of actions for safety for us, but also in the communities where we operate, the extended contractors, many of the places where, well, all the places where we're producing. Supply and demand, I think that it was spoken extensively today, the communities and that liquidity. So for us, I mean, John, in the way that we look into it is, how do we run the business, having also the public responsibility of delivering some of these products that very quite essential, like soap or disinfectants, to people and community around the places where we need to do. And so do we do it for the UNGPs and due diligence? I mean, all of you know and have been part of it, of our journey, and contribute in many ways. And we have John Ruggie, fortunately, also as an advisor in our council. I mean, our approach was to embed human rights. Of course, we do due diligence, but if I embed it, I mean, when I came on board, I said, if we embed it at the point in the fabric of the organization, as imperfect as we will be, there's a lot of work to do, but if we embed it at the decision-making moment, then I don't need to be controlling and saying, oh, well, we need to do this or we need to do the other. One of the things that have been extraordinary for me is to see how I talk about unity and I talk about the values, and that's what I was referring to, this foundation of human rights. I mean, whether it's my colleague who decided to create, be part of this collaboration to manufacture ventilators. We don't know how to do that, we cannot manufacture, but we can do logistics, right? So we can help them by bringing to places. Or is the individuals that they are thinking about water, or is thinking about, you know, communities that we are not producing maybe in the neighborhood, but it wasn't ours, and how do we train in better hygiene practices? So, I mean, many of these foundations that Anita and Salil talk about is there. And as I said to all of you, I don't intend to believe that we are perfect. I mean, we are so many, so large, and we need to do so much. But I think that has been our approach, and it was embedded in the USLP. And now, under the leadership of a new CEO, I mean, you see the continuity. Alan Job has been absolutely extraordinary as a commander in the middle of this, pandemic. I mean, he has made it absolutely clear for everybody that safety was foremost and where we were putting our priorities. I'm going to stop.
Yes, I'm just the last 15 minutes now, and I'm wanting to give Anita and Salil a brief response to this if they want to come in now, and then I want to just take some of the questions that have come online. Anita, Salil, anything to add in terms of what you've heard?
Yeah, just a couple of things, and I can actually address some of the questions as part of this. I think Marcela's point is one that illustrates that if you embed these processes and you know how to ask the right questions about impacts to people, then when there is a crisis, you're able to move and think because your decision-making and processes are different. So that's, I think, the core point that Sharan, myself, and others are making is we need to do this and we need to make it mandatory. Now, I think there are questions about, well, if business has no capital, how do we do this, right? If they don't have the money to make the investments in these social protections and things, that's where we get back to your question, John. Number one, that the money that is coming from governments and from international institutions as part of a recovery package needs to ask for responsible processes and due diligence in companies. So we need to make that connection, and then we give companies the resources to do that. And then we ask them to do what they can do, right? So we ask them within the constraints of what their business model and their capital and profit and loss is, we want them to at least go through the process of saying, how can we be protective and respective of rights? That's all, right? That's the key issue. And you may not be able to do it all, right? We're not saying you have to keep everyone on the payroll if there is no payroll that you have. So I just want to make that clear. A couple of just quick questions. Someone asked about force majeure, right? And the fact that, is force majeure consistent with the guiding principles? I think we have to ask that question and look at it now and say the guiding principles would have companies asking that question long before they sign a contract, right? So that if force majeure has to be declared, or if we're in a situation like that now, there is a contingency plan to mitigate harm, right? That's what the guiding principles are about. There's no absolutes, but it's saying, okay, if you're going to say we can't perform this contract, have you thought through the consequences to the people who you are impacting? That's the key. And lastly, I should just say, and John, back to you in terms of the ICC and business and human rights, I'm part of the working group on business and human rights that focuses on the guiding principles, right? The treaty process is a separate government-driven process. We advise in the sense that we want anything that ever happens with the treaty to be consistent with the guiding principles and not to turn us back. But at the moment, when there are questions saying, is this time for a treaty? In some ways, the answer may be yes, right? Wouldn't it be great to have a level playing field? But I fear that we shouldn't put all of our eggs into the treaty basket now, because governments, given all of these crises, aren't going to be as equipped to engage in robust multilateral, typical technical treaty negotiations. So if we can get wins at the national or regional levels, like in the EU, in the North American context, wherever we can around due diligence, we should certainly press for that, even if these multilateral processes go on. So I don't say no to treaty, but I also say don't foreclose what's happening at the national and regional levels. Thanks.
So can I come in for one comment? One thing that Anita said, and talking about the funding that the government is given, I think that there is a point also of reflection for business. I mean, this is not a free funding for any company, right? We have taken the position that there are certain business who really need the fund. Everybody's suffering. I mean, every single company is going to have an impact, but there are different degrees. And the intention of that funding that many of the companies are deploying is to really help the most needy business and people impacting within those business. So I think that we need to reflect. I have seen some actions by some companies that apply to it and then said, wait a minute, I mean, I'm not the most stressed right now, others should be. And I wanted to add up to you, Anita, because I think that is a principle of good governance stewardship that should be applied to this as well.
Great. All right. Last 10 minutes. I'm going to turn to you, Salil, but as I do, I'm just asking everyone to sum up. I'll start with you, Salil, and we'll go back through everybody. There's so many questions. We had 40 before this started. We've had, God knows how many we've had in the past 80 minutes. We are going to post all the questions online and give all of you the chance to respond to those who haven't been able to live. Several of you have responded to questions in real time, which is great. The question that I see here that hasn't quite been answered, there are many that have been answered, but the one that's in my mind is whether we're calling for a new social contract or if we're calling for greater resilience, whatever, which is the entity or the organization that's going to deliver this? 1919, 1945, 1947, new organizations were being built around global governance. And, a lot of people are saying the UN, even the UN has less leverage than it did 10 years ago at the time of the financial crisis. Which is the organization? Do we need to build a new one, or are there existing organizations that can lead the change to the new social contract or stronger resilience? And I'll start with you, Salil, and then I'll give everyone a chance to answer. Salil.
Yeah, so I think Denton initially talked about the institutions that have been built and how, and I think there is a lot of logic to that we cannot rely on one entity to do it. I mean, if we are waiting for, there's a play by Bertolt Brecht called Galileo, and in that there's a very nice line where Andrea comes to Galileo and says, pity the nation without heroes. And Brecht writes, but Galileo replies, pity the nation in need of heroes. And I think we need to think of that we don't need to create a new hero, a new institution. We have to build on the strength and leverage of everything, because the point that John was making was about sequencing. All the things are happening at the same time. A political crisis, a social crisis, a health crisis, and an economic crisis. At that time, do we really want to build a new institution that deals with it, or to empower one institution with all the power, given all the political realities where you can't say nasty things about the one large country about which we shall not dare to use its name because it's making all our equipment and masks and all that, and they might give us substandard stuff if we say nasty things about them. I mean, this is the scenario we are in. So I think we need to go back to our individual strengths and what Marcela was talking about. When she said that Unilever cannot make ventilators, but they know how to logistically make sure that they reach from point A to B. So build on the strengths, which is what we have in the report. Treaty would be great, and Anita is very right in saying that let's not put eggs in that basket. Because my question would be, treaty for what? Is it for reporting? Is it for compliance? Is it for some kind of complicity and so on? So I think building on leverages of each institution and extending with the common goal. Common goal is, of course, getting rid of the virus of the coronavirus, but the bigger virus of inequality, injustice, and human rights violations. Those are the things we need to fight.
Salil, thank you. Reverse order. Anita, final comment.
Yep. Just my final comment here is, how do we push governments and change? And again, I don't think we're going to be able to build new architecture for new organizations. So we have to work with the ones we have, at least for now. And so my call would be, of course, again, that this is the place for civil society and other voices to be made as visible as possible. But the second piece of this too is that, as Salil just mentioned, I think mine is that this is a common goal, which is combating a public health issue, where if we can't come together, right, it's not about civil and political rights anymore. I mean, although those are being trampled upon, but in terms of the common goal, the shared health and well-being, we are all in this together. And so that message is the one that we need to just continually push business and governments to really understand in those global fora.
Thank you, Anita. Marcela?
I thought you were going the other way around. Look, this is it's hard to say, but this is not going to be the last time that this happened. I mean, actually, we will have to figure it out how to come together. Do we need a new organization, a new beginning? Now, I think that we have what we need, and now we need to work together. I mean, it's so politicized. I mean, sometimes it just makes me very upset about it. But I need to understand every different point of view to be able to engage and come up forward with a solution, right? So I think the focus should be in action, and the focus should be in the well-being of everybody, not on the private interest. I mean, even trade and commerce and everything should be serving everybody at this moment, right? And we need to stop this polar position, or is it about lives or is it about economic recovery? It should be about all of that, but with a new model. I mean, I think that Sharan said it at the beginning of today. So that's where I'm personally cheering for.
So, John, can we have a new model without new institutions?
Look, thanks very much, and apologies again, Marcela, I didn't hear what you said. Sure, it was just pure genius. I'm totally practical about these sorts of things. Go where you can find it. The reality is, and we've seen this before, there are countries whose it's in their interests for cooperation, and they cooperate. Look what happened with the collapse of the TPP. And it was in the interest of a number of Asia Pacific economies to actually still go on and actually create an agreement. It is in the interest. So really what I'm saying is go where there are people who are prepared to act, and that's with institutions as well. Go and work with institutions that are prepared to change and take up this opportunity. There are some that are so inertia-ridden that I wouldn't even waste my time. There are countries at middle power level who it's in their interests to actually cooperate on these things, and you start building that. Because you could well die waiting for G2 to come to the party on this. So as Anita said, we're all in this together. So find where the leverage points are. We are clearly leverageable, and we're clearly capable of leveraging, and we will do that.
Thank you, John. Sharan, final words.
Well, I'm intrigued by one of the questions, and it's a great quote. It says, the COVID-19 has exposed the degradation of work and the decent work agenda over the last 20 years. And in recovery, there's a fine line between vision and hallucination. No return to normal when that normal was part of the problem. I think that kind of could be the debate for a very long time on the recovery and it's actually, his name is Steve Craig. So Steve, I hope I didn't butcher it. But what I would say to you is we can't gloss over the failures that existed 12 months ago, a decade ago, 2 decades ago. And for us, that breakdown of the social contract happened with, the explosion of globalization. Not all globalization is bad, but it is not acceptable that business can only survive. And John, I clearly have a few drinks to buy you to convince you that due diligence is critical and it's a fair competition flaw. But business shouldn't survive if their only survival mode is dehumanizing exploitation. I know John doesn't believe that. So, you know, I can never say that this model should exist and we put money first before you put people first. The economy should serve nations, and it should serve nations for development and security. So, you know, are we joined at the hip with business? Yes, because that's about jobs. But I also want to say to you that there is an unfair competition flaw here. I work with Unilever. I work with many CEOs in the B team. I work with John and other business institutions. But they are the business that are thoughtful and humane and believe in a floor of rules. You can't have a lawless society, and yet in the world of work, we've had a lawless society. It's simply that, the law of the jungle. And 60% of our work is informal work. No rights, no social protection, no minimum wages, nothing. That's not a world any of us wants to see. So we need due diligence. We need companies to be based on an acceptance that they have a commitment to human rights and to equality. But I also want to say to you that look at the reality. We clap every night at 8 o'clock in gratitude for the frontline workers. I prefer frontline workers too, because essential workers has a terrible legal connotation, but frontline workers who are actually giving up their safety or risking their safety to actually serve us. Health workers first and foremost, but then all those other service workers. And you know, they're amongst the lowest paid. 70% of women are in fact in the health industry, and 53% in services are women. How many years have we fought for equality, not just of opportunity, but of equal pay? And yet these things could be fixed in a coordinated plan with a new social contract for the future. So the ITC has three front lines. One is, of course, the new social contract, and that's even more critical now as we recover from COVID-19. The other that's part of that, but is actually about just transition for climate and employment, because we need to build back employment. As I said, the B20 today called for a global employment plan. That's about growth. It's about shared income. It's about prosperity. It's about paying your tax. And the third one is rebuilding trust in democracy. So if we don't have the redesign elements, because we're honest enough to say what the problems are and talk through honestly what consensus is around the future based on rights, then I don't think we're going to build trust back in democracy. And none of us, we've already been alarmed at the lack of or the growth in authoritarianism, fascism, and so on. That's going to get worse if we can't actually find a way to include people. And my final shout out on the question of using this as an opportunity is to several of the Nordic countries. I was talking to Iceland this morning, but Denmark I call out, and Sweden and others. They've put conditionality that the international institutions never did on their support for business, which says no share buybacks in the next 2 years, at least in Denmark's terms. No business can get support if it's actually in tax havens. And we want to see a bunch of other stuff, which I won't go into. But this is good thinking because it goes to putting in place the kind of conditions we would all expect for responsible business, and that we talk about it, the OECD and other places. So I would say finally on the multilateral front, you know, we can't have the institutions that exist in their current form, but we can find a way to demand and coordinate action and rebuild, I think, as we go along, because the competition between UN agencies is driving me nuts. I'm sure it's driving everyone nuts, because it's not then allowing the money in the amount you need to be directed where it needs to be directed. So we need much greater coordination and the courage for us all to speak out and say, we want a global UN system, but we don't want this one in its current form. So let's look together at how we reform it. And by the way, I think Guterres has done a terrific job with a number of other agencies like the WHO and so on, but we do need coordination and reform.
So rebuild as we go along, I think, is the mantra there. Thank you for that. Thank you to all of the speakers for a very interesting discussion. It's just the beginning. Our commitment as IHRB is obviously to publish this online. We did have a lot of people join. We had a lot of questions. We'll publish those as well. We'll try and respond and invite speakers to respond. For our own part, we have a next one of these on the 7th of May. We will have the voice of workers from Bangladesh directly represented in that call, both from the business side and also the union side. At least 2 million jobs are on the line in Bangladesh at the moment, and so we really wanted to prioritize that. And then on the 20th of May, with the London Metals Exchange and the OECD and the Swiss government looking at the trade, some of the trade dimensions for this as well. So do join us for those if you can. Thank you for joining us today. Stay safe. If you're one of the countries that's clapping for frontline workers tonight, we are here in 2.5 hours. Please go out and clap. Please stay safe. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.